好，首先呢，我简单的介绍一下我们今天的 speaker，Mr. Lavan 跟他的女儿 Solène。Dr. Lavan 呢，他是在南加州长大的，他本科呢毕业于南加州大学，然后在巴黎的索邦大学拿的音乐史和音乐学的博士，然后在剑桥大学呢研究过文学。Mr. Lavan 在音乐和文学方面呢有很多的研究，那在这两方面呢也帮助和指导了许多的孩子。他的太太 Maria 出生于法国，也是文学博士。夫妻俩呢是 homeschool 了3个孩子，2个女儿，1个儿子。然后2个女儿都去了普林斯顿，那儿子呢在哥伦比亚，所以 homeschool 就是他们都是自己在家里教的。我简单讲一下，就是我们是怎么认识 Miss Lavan 跟 Mr. Lavan 的。我们当时是想给自己的孩子找阅读和写作方面的老师，那么经朋友介绍呢，介绍给他们，然后接触之后就觉得非常好。那想到这么好的老师呢，不介绍耳湾就特别可惜。所以很幸运呢，就他们就愿意来到我们中间，教孩子们写作和阅读。这是 Mr. Lavan，Miss Lavan 呢是他们的2女儿，是普林斯顿毕业。Solène 呢也是继承了家族的传统，在音乐和文学方面呢也是有很多研究，也很喜欢教孩子，主要呢是指导孩子写作。同时呢，他也辅导孩子申请大学，那许多他辅导的孩子呢都进入了美国的名校。那么今天呢，我们很高兴就是请到他们来给我们讲一下大学申请中一些要注意的事项，包括在申请材料中几个主要的部分，尤其是如果说要申请进入顶尖大学的话，有哪些特别需要注意的。我自己的大儿子很快也要上高中了，所以我和大家一样，也是很希望听他们的讲座，希望从中呢能够有一些学习和启发。OK， 那我介绍就到这里。最后，如果大家有问题的话，我们最后有问答的时间。OK, all right, very good. So I finished the Chinese introduction. Now I'll give the time to Solène and Dr. Lavan.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
Thank you.
We're very happy to be here to talk about our work that we started together a few years ago, and then that I carried out even before then, in helping students to maximize their chances in the college admissions process. There is never any guarantee for getting into the colleges nowadays, especially the top 20 schools and Ivy League schools that some parents might set their eyes on for their children. But there are a number of ways that you can drastically increase your chances, and there are various realities about the college admissions process that most parents are not aware of, which we try to help with as much as possible. And this will be the subject of our discussion today. I'm going to start sharing my screen and a little presentation that I prepared with Dr. Lavan. The first aspect of college admissions that some parents might not realize, and this is the same of any school, even those that don't belong to the Ivy League or to the top 20 school, but also very good schools that one would be proud to have their child attend, is that admissions officers generally make decisions within 20 to 25 minutes by placing an application in one of 3 piles. And the first pile that we're going to talk about today is the no pile. Every basic requirement that is not met, high enough test scores, high enough GPA, a course load that's not demanding enough, will get you put immediately on the no pile before they have a chance to look at the other parts of your application, such as your extracurriculars, or anything that makes you unique or distinctive as a candidate. So the first job of any parent who's invested in their child's success is to make sure that their child passes all of those basic requirements so as to avoid getting put immediately in the no pile, and depends according to school. So the basic requirements for being a top candidate at any school with any degree of prestige is pretty much the same across the board, as analyzed by many metrics, and specifically the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. And that is to say, a high GPA, a difficult curriculum, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, test scores that are within the top 25% of admitted students. So obviously this depends from school to school. For an Ivy League, this means scores that are almost perfect, that range from perfect to almost perfect. And then if one is looking at an excellent school, but that's a little bit less prestigious, let's say, like Williams College, which is an excellent liberal arts school, then it will be a little bit lower down the line. One of the services that we provide is immediately making a test-taking plan starting in 8th grade, looking at what tests are required, how much work will need to be put into meeting the scores that are needed for your dream school, however challenging that might be. Let's talk about test scores. And this is the part that I'm going to take over more than my father because he specializes more. The aspects of your application that make you stand out, not the aspects of your application that will get you rejected immediately if you don't meet those requirements.
That would be more my specialty.
Just what you need in order to be considered, not in order to stand out. So the basic minimum requirement that every student should look at as they enter 8th grade and start thinking about what their future will be like, starting early to plan for the best outcome. So during the pandemic, a strange and sort of unprecedented event happened in the scene of college admissions, which is that tests became optional for most schools. And I'm talking here about the top 20 and the Ivy Leagues, but a lot of this applies down the board since many colleges take the lead of those top universities. So in the wake of the pandemic, this was the new policy. However, it is important not to get deceived by this new metric. Tests
Yes.
are still just as important as they ever were. As a matter of fact, the elimination of the requirement is more to attract low-income students, students of various diverse ethnic backgrounds. And so for us Caucasian and Asian American applicants, it's still important to do everything that's listed as optional to give oneself an added boost. It's still important to take your SAT, to take your ACT. We provide test-taking private sessions to help boost those scores up, again, starting early in freshman year already to prepare is what we recommend for the best outcome. And we also provide counseling services to advise students on what kind of school they can aspire to, based on graphs such as the one that you see here. These are all the Ivy League schools, and as you can see, here is listed, and one can get up-to-date information depending on what kind of schools you're looking at. You can see the scores of the top 75% of candidates, and then the scores that are in the bottom 25%. Now, the important thing to understand is that if you're a student who scored lower and you're in the bottom 25%, you might have been admitted and have had your lower score overlooked due to a variety of reasons. You may be an athlete, and so that score is good enough for you because they needed you as an athlete. You might be an artist, a musician, and they needed you for their music department or their arts program, and so you can get by on that. You might be from a diverse socioeconomic background, which would always be important to highlight. And so you can get away with a slightly lower score, or you might have what we call the wow factor to your application, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that allows an admissions officer to put you on the lower end. But nowhere is it a good strategy to believe that if you do not meet these scores, that you can still have a chance at these top schools. And again, part of the service we provide is trying to look at realistically what your child can attain with the proper guidance, with the proper test-taking prep, starting early enough to then have a good chance of acceptance and to not reach too high, not reach too low. So the last thing that's important to know, and it's going to be related to our next point about how to choose courses for your child throughout their 4 years of high school to best position them for a prestigious school, admissions into a prestigious school. It's very important, the AP courses, and then of course the AP test. So in addition to taking an SAT or an ACT and scoring high on it within the 25 to 75% of the school to which you're looking to apply or the types of schools you're looking to apply, you're also going to want to aim for 4 to 8 AP exams, which you usually take, I would recommend in your junior year, at least the majority of them in your junior year.
And start preparing for it earlier than that, of course.
The earlier, the better.
Solène, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned like officially those SAT tests are put to be optional for those top schools, but you said like in reality for, let's say, standard applicants, say Caucasians, Asian Americans, but by default, you actually need to take the SAT.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, just
Yes.
to clarify. So although it lists on paper that it's optional, in general, this is a general rule of the application process, I would say. If something is listed as optional, make sure to do it. Because already the percentage for admissions to any of these schools, as we know, ranges from 4%, starting at 4% at an Ivy League, to a more modest 20% for an excellent school like USC, which is still very tough. So you're going to want to do everything to get noticed.
There's very little, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's very little chance without taking the test to get in, unless you are belonging to a disfavored ethnic minority. But also there is, of course, that very small chance if somebody if a student invents something extraordinary and doesn't take the test, then of course in that situation it's possible to get in, but that's an extremely rare occurrence.
Miss Levan, do you mind if I translate this one?
Yes.
No problem.
OK 我想家长们可能大部分应该也是听明白了，就是说我们都知道以前讲就是 SAT 啊这些成绩都变成 optional 了，对那些 top school，但那些 optional 呢只是对特别的 group。这里 prerequisites 就不讲就怎么特别 group，但大家都知道，如果说对于比方说像 Miss Levan 他们 Caucasian 啊，或者说对我们 Chinese American 的话，一定不能是 optional， 这个是一定要 take 的，那就是说一定要尽自己的努力考得最好了。如果说不 take 的话，那么除非说有其他特别的成绩，否则的话被录取的可能对这些好学校录取的可能性很低。
I wanted to say one thing that we're going to get to this in a minute, but we're only talking about scores right now. But many of the Ivy League schools, many of the top schools emphasize the fact that their admissions process is what they term holistic. So they don't take one factor into consideration. It's a combination of many factors. Not only the test scores, not only the grades, not only the AP courses, but the activities that take place, volunteer activities, basically what makes the candidate unique, which are equally important. And then, of course, the admissions essays, which are a large point. I think maybe de-emphasized how important they are. It's often de-emphasized, but they are. We know that the essays are an integral part of the admission success.
Exactly. So it's important to stress that we're covering what is recommended for consideration, so you're not put in the no pile. But once you're out of the no pile, it's not enough to simply be a good student and to have a high test score. It's just the beginning. And so we're going to get to all of that other part of the applications process, which also, as Dr. Levan mentioned, can sometimes make up for the fact that you're a little bit weaker, not by much, but a little bit weaker in certain other areas like courses or test scores.
Or even grades. Even grades. There are people who've gotten into Ivy Leagues without having a 4.0.
But then they have to have something really strong to make up for it. So it's all a balancing act of how excellent you can be in many ways.
That's right.
So again, the basic requirements. So many parents ask, how should I plan for my student to take the right kind of courses for their 4 years of high school? How do I make a course plan? And the truth of the matter is it's important to start already in 8th grade thinking about what that's going to look like for your child. And the general rule is that the schools are looking for a combination of consistent courses where you're always taking English, math, social science, laboratory science, and a foreign language for each quarter and every year, so that they see the same subjects being built upon over time. And then they're going to want to see as well challenging courses, meaning that whatever your school provides as a higher level class, whether that's AP, IB, or honors courses, you're going to want to take as many of that for your child as they can handle while still maintaining a good grade. And then finally, it's very important, and we're going to talk about why later, that in any electives that they can choose to take, that they take full advantage of expressing their personality or any talents that they may have. So if your school happens to provide something unique, like photography, and your child has some kind of interest in that, it It can be a way to kickstart something unique about your child, which can then later become a basis for making them stand out beyond just having good grades. They can talk about it in their essays. They can then take a summer course in photography that shows that they went above and beyond just their classes.
Just one example among the many different interests that one can explore.
Exactly. So it's a combination of consistent courses, challenging courses, and courses demonstrating interest. One thing to note is that usually, if your school provides it, you're going to want to take 3 to 4 advanced classes per year. So usually those are AP classes, which is quite a lot if you think about it, even starting in freshman year for the very top schools. Now, of course, it's all a balancing act, as we said. If it's not possible for you to maintain good grades while taking that many AP courses, it's better to take a little bit fewer and then get good grades in all of them.
Yes.
The last point is also some schools might not have access to these AP, IB, and honors courses. So what is the solution for that? I will say that Dr. Levan knows about this very well because I was homeschooled, as we learned in the introduction, as well as my siblings, who all were fortunate enough to make it into very good schools. And so because of the homeschooling situation, we didn't have an AP class offered at our school. But there are ways that you can get the same thing, excellent colleges that are fully accredited online. And it's even a good option for those who do have many options at their schools. For example, if your child is overloaded and there's simply too much academic work and they feel a bit swamped, they can take an AP course during the summer offered through one of these vendors. And we're thinking specifically of Stanford Online High School, has an excellent, it's by admissions, but it's not so selective to get in, and it has really excellent AP courses. Northwestern hosts the same kind of programs, and Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth. And these are all very well regarded by colleges.
I would even say that it may be preferable to take at least one course from one of these or other schools that offer high schools that offer the AP courses, because it looks very good when you have an AP course from Stanford Online High School or from Johns Hopkins, and that one can mix maybe an AP course from what the high school is offering, but also one from one of these institutions.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's true.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
If we get the AP course from Stanford and the 3 schools you list here, when we apply the college, do we need to tell the high school put the AP in your transcript, or you just submit separate?
It would be reflected on your school transcript.
So this is score to your schools.
That's right, because they're all fully accredited through their respective states and nationally. So it's not as if it's something separate. If you take one of these courses, then it would be reflected.
But one also has a certificate or of proof of success in the school, so that can also be added as a supplement. But I do believe it appears on the same transcript.
Oh, that's good to know. And also, when we apply a college, it's a student already in the 12th grade. And the AP test are usually in May. When you apply, for example, this November, and the 12th grade AP course will not in your transcript. So if so, do we still need take more AP? Is this help? Just take the course, don't have credit, don't have the score yet.
If I can rephrase your question, you're sort of asking what happens when you're already applying, when the time to apply is coming, and you want to add more AP classes, but you're not sure whether this will be seen by the admissions committee. Is that the question?
Yes, because you just current taking your course not end, you don't take you don't know the result yet. Can they also treat those like give you credit or?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Solène, but I do believe that as long as they haven't started looking at the applications yet, that one can always send in and add another document to the file.
Right. So the important thing is that's very difficult if the application is already approaching. Generally speaking, and this is why we recommend starting very early in planning, so that these kind of situations don't happen. Usually the first review of the materials is not going to include necessarily what you've done after the time of application. However, as Dr. Levan mentioned, it is possible to send supplementary materials to the school. For example, it works in many situations too. Let's say you apply to a school and they're still considering you, and you just won a national award, and you want that to be considered in your application. You didn't know about the result before you applied. Or let's say here that you decided to sort of add a little bit retroactively, a little late in the game, a little bit more AP distinction. Then you can send that through a form that I didn't prepare it in this presentation, but I know about the process. You can address 2 specific admissions offices, asking them to add it to your dossier and to your
Yes.
file. And most of the time, if you establish a personal rapport, which is not something that many people know, they will consider it and look at it. So maybe at the end of this presentation, we can find an example of that form that you would submit to have supplementary materials considered, because that's an excellent question.
Thank you.
I think there's a question in the chat too about this on this subject.
Yeah, when
Let's
you
see.
say take an AP course from online school, do you take something independent from what you're doing with your own school already? For example, you pick pre-cal statistics, yes, and multivariable calculus. You want to do all 4 from your school, right? Yeah, if your school offers it in a sequence, then you would definitely take it at your school, and that would be sufficient and easier and preferable. So the other options only apply to the fact if your school doesn't offer an option. So for example, let's say your child has shown some interest in drawing and some talent in drawing, and colleges do enjoy talent very much, but your class doesn't have AP Art Studio, but one of these online classes does. It kind of would be important to have a formal way of proving your child's proficiency in art beyond just them claiming to be good at it. So you might want to look into that. But in terms of if your school already has an AP course, an AP sequence, you can have your child follow that, and that's better.
But for example, some schools don't offer, many don't, music theory. That's just one example. But to show that you're proficient in music theory might be a very good addition.
If you're a musician. So a lot of this is individualized, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Tailored to the individual interests of each student.
Excellent question we have here. How about taking college courses, university or community college while in high school? An excellent thing to do.
Yes.
It's an excellent thing to do. It functions in the same way as taking any other advanced course. Every time that you do something like this, an AP course, an honors course, an IB course, a college course, you're proving to the school that you're ready for college level work. You're ready for a college level course load, and whatever can prove that is going to help. So definitely, if there's something your child is interested in, and especially if you can do it over the summer where their time is a little bit freer, and therefore they have a higher chance of doing well in the class and enjoying it, definitely something one ought to look into. Very good question. So we're going to pass over the next 2 slides quickly because we spent a lot of time on this point, but I'm so happy we had great questions. But basically, it depends on the school. I would highly encourage parents to look at the requirements for each school, and this is obviously something that we like helping with when we advise students in course and curriculum planning, which is definitely something that we start in 8th grade. Some schools are very clear about what they require, like Stanford and Dartmouth, for example, just to give you a rough idea. And they tell you exactly what they want your child to have taken by the time that they apply. So this can be a really fantastic guideline to preparing course selection. So I'm just going to leave it on here a little bit so that you can see what it is. 4 years, an emphasis on writing and literature, so obviously something AP in that department. Mathematics, 4 years. History, social studies, 3 or more years. Science, 3 or more years. Foreign language, 3 or more years. The same foreign language taken at the highest level that one possibly can, and the same for Dartmouth. Other schools, and this might be a little bit mystifying to parents, although I would always recommend parents to always choose the strictest guidelines just so that you cover every possibility for your child
That's
and they
right.
have a higher chance overall. So while I would base their course choice on what Dartmouth and Stanford require, for example, some schools are not as prescriptive. They simply require somewhat nebulously defined level of high engagement and increasing difficulty as they pass from freshman to senior year.
But it's not as if they're going to eliminate you because you haven't taken this or that calculus class. Yale, Columbia, for example, have a different policy, which is a bit more holistic and freer
Yeah.
in that sense.
I'll give you personal examples. Me and many other friends that I know, to get into Princeton, we took the highest, most rigorous course load of APs. But those who get into Columbia don't necessarily need the same metric. It's not that it's not as difficult to get in, but they value other things, such as your commitment to community service, or the fact that you stand out among a sea of applicants. So every school weights a little bit differently. And all you can do as a parent is just try to have your child meet the highest benchmark in every possible field of
But
consideration.
what is possible to them, and that's the one thing that one has to assess, because
Right.
we have to always caution about becoming overwhelmed and then actually not doing as well because taking on too much. So that's one of the things, one of the aspects I think that we help with determining
Yes.
what would be best and what would be possible also,
Right.
according to
Because
each student's individual needs and aptitudes.
that's the key word, as Dr. Levan said, is individual. The whole college admissions process is marked by rules, which we're giving to you here, and then also rules that must be adapted to the individual in order to maximize what is unique about them. And that's the harder part to do on one's own. Hopefully, at least some of the tips we share today can help you start thinking about what that means more specifically. And maybe before we move on, I should ask if anyone has any questions about the basic requirements. Once your child has gotten an excellent test scores, once your child has taken a rigorous course load and planned it all out, which is something that we help with, and succeeded in it. Once your child has taken the APs and gotten scores of 3 and higher, you don't want to report scores lower than 3, and even 3 is not very good to send in. Do we have any questions about those basic metrics that get
I have a
you?
question. Yeah, so Solène, you mentioned like for those top private schools like Yale and Columbia, they have different different emphasis. Although like each school probably they all say like holistic, but some school put more emphasis on holistic. Like Yale probably emphasize more, like you also mentioned, like Princeton emphasize more on like you go to take those rigorous and difficult courses. Now my question is, how about for those top public schools? Say Berkeley and those places, do they have like difference in terms of their emphasis?
Excellent question. I should have addressed that. So it depends. It's kind of strange now. My answer now is different than it would have been a few years ago, because when the pandemic hit, there were some drastic changes, what was expected or allowed. And so there are some UC schools that have eradicated test scores entirely, which is very confusing, which means that they would prioritize much more the holistic parts of your application.
I remember though that Berkeley, compared to some of the Ivy Leagues, for example, just to take Berkeley or UCLA, I do remember that there was correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a little bit less emphasis on the other aspects than the academic. It was really based a lot on the test scores and the grades, and of course the other aspects counted, but maybe not quite as much.
Right.
And in some
And
of the private schools.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. I just wanted to confirm that. And also, even though it's not pleasant to discuss, that's also why the student body at such schools is much more of a larger percentage of Asian or Asian American students, because that demographic tends to do very well in testing very high in their scores and their GPA and so forth. Whereas at Ivy League schools or at the top 20 liberal arts schools, that is not often the case. It's not that the applicants who are Asian American or Asian suddenly did worse in that pool. It's simply because the school has decided not to only look at academic excellence as the #1 benchmark for whether someone should get in. And that's
But
what
the
they
problem
prioritize.
now is that in the public schools, it's changed in the last couple of years. So
Right.
they're trying to de-emphasize the test scores.
Right. So it's in a
So
transition
that
period.
is a problem. Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to say, but it's a little bit of a now it's less clear than it was maybe 4 years ago. Because then you really knew, I mean, if you had excellent test scores, if you had excellent grades and you had some of the top test scores, you could get into Berkeley. It was pretty sure. Am I right?
Yeah, that's true.
But I don't know now.
Yeah, now it's unclear. I hope that answers well enough the question.
Yeah, I wish we could give you a better answer.
Okay, these principles again hold true for many schools. But once your child has reached a certain basic level of excellence academically, and I don't mean basic in the sense that it's easy, but in the sense that you need to have this to even be considered, and you've made it out of the no pile, your application, very sadly, can still be thrown into another pile, which is just as bad because it doesn't lead to an acceptance. And this is what is known as the LMO pile, which is a name that was given to the pile by many admissions officers over the years. And it stands for like many others. That is to say that in their 20 minutes of reading an application, an admissions counselor might see that a student is really, really good at school. They're very involved in school clubs. They might be president of their debate team or president of student life or student government or something. It's all very good, but it's like many, many other candidates. And when you only can choose 4 to 20% of top candidates, this can be a big problem because the admissions officer, when speaking to their supervisor, might write a sentence, and this is from a real email sent to a supervisor at UPenn. So the admissions officer might write to the supervisor, this student did not stand out in our application pool. There's nothing wrong with their application. They're excellent, but they're like 10 others, so we recommend that you deny. So after one has taken the right courses, done well in test scores, how can one avoid this pile? It's difficult to say what schools are looking for because, again, every school is slightly different. But for the most part, most of the top schools are looking for wow factor, which is difficult to define. But it can look like any one of these following metrics. Your child could perhaps prove excellence in a field. I'll give you an example. You could be the best baseball catcher in your state, and you have awards that you've won to prove it. Or you can be an extraordinary pianist, and you've won up to the National Association of Music Teachers first place
Competition.
in your state. And so you can prove excellence that way and stand out. You could be the winner of the Scripps Spelling Bee, which is rather unusual. And this will stand out in a sea of applicants because not everybody does those things. A lot of people can be well-rounded and join many clubs at school and be involved with things they do at school. But what do they do outside of school? That is what contributes to the wow factor. Another example of a good candidate would be someone who spearheads original projects. I'll give you actually an example of someone close to me, my brother. He was the kind of person who, from a very early age, from the age of about 14, enjoyed making startups. And through his own initiative, he was able to get them featured on various media outlets for technology like Hacker News. And they would go to the #1 spot. And he wrote that down in his resume, and it became an important feature of his application. So anytime that you have something original, you might be a writer and have written a novel or a series of poems that you've gotten published in a local journal or something like that. The more that you can show distinctive personality and creativity, the more your application has wow factor. Another way is you can engage in activities usually reserved for adults. For example, any time that you can make a small business and you can have a few investors to start it out, that's usually something that most high schoolers wouldn't do. What would be typical is, for example, to make a dog sitting business. That's not going to stand out in an application because most students do that, or a babysitting endeavor. That's not going to be unique. But if you are the kind of crafty child who is creative, finding business strategies and starting to work on these things in various ways, this could be a wow factor. I'm just going to pause here before I move on. Some of you parents might be thinking, how on earth do I develop that in my child? I don't see how. We'll give you some tips and tricks that you can use, especially if your child is in 8th or 9th grade, where they can start to develop their passions and develop them as far as they can and with as much concrete proof as they can to develop wow factor in one of these various ways.
But it's important to discern that it's something that they would really feel strongly about personally. Part of the interview process, if we work with a student, we try to bring out or somehow reveal what that personal interest could be and explore. It's very important to discern as early as one can.
Yes, as Dr. Levan mentioned, and we'll talk about the kind of help that we can provide. Some of our help, as we said, has to do with curriculum counseling. So choosing what courses a child is going to take to reflect their interests and also show enough depth and level of difficulty to impress colleges. Other forms of advising we give include extracurricular counseling, which can again start quite young, where you start to identify what your child is already strong in and then to maximize that as much as possible so that by the time that they start applying, they have a dossier to prove real engagement in their fields of interest that are not common, that express themselves in ways that are not common. So the last 3 points I think you see here, I mean, anytime you can get numbers on your achievement, whether you fundraised a tremendous amount of money and you have proof of it, or you've written op-eds to highlight a cause, a social cause in your local newspaper, or you've even gotten press coverage for something that you did, as was the case for my brother, notably, but also many students that are successful that we work with, the better it is. Sometimes it's just enough not to be the best at something, but just to be unique enough that it's odd and therefore interesting to college admissions counselors. Let's say that you're a female football player. That's so unique and so strange. You could write a whole essay about it and include that in your activities section, and that's going to make them remember you beyond your excellent test scores because it's so rare. Or you're a lepidopterist in your spare time. You like studying butterflies. Not every high schooler does that. And so if you happen to do something strange like that, the worst thing you can do is not mention it and not make it an important part of your application. If you're obsessed with military history and starting in 9th grade, you're going to want to find the very rare opportunities that prove your interest in military history and then craft that into a statement about your personality as a whole and your future career goals, which, by the way, can change once you get admitted to a school. As long as you get your foot in the door, whatever is most convincing to the application committee is what you're going to want to emphasize. And then lastly, this is an important point because many times students do excellently in gaining president titles, vice president titles in school clubs. But unfortunately, it used to be enough, but in the last 10 years, college admissions officers have become aware that a lot of the time these leadership titles are in name only, and that it doesn't mean you actually made a real change in your school or your community. It didn't require any individual effort from you. So if you do have a leadership position at your school or at any leadership position in general, you're going to want to capitalize on that to do something that no other president or vice president in your school club has done before with a concrete result, whether you raised money or changed attitudes about bullying in your school. It can be really anything. And then you're going to want to document that or highlight it in your essay section to make yourself stand out. So this is the consideration after you've got academic excellence. How do you go beyond that and really wow an admissions committee? Because after all, and this brings us to our next point, most of the time after they've read your application, they're going to narrow down everything about your application to 1 or 2 sentences that they're going to forward to the supervisor. And that's going to determine whether you get in or not, whether you stand out or whether you get put to the LMO pile. And that's not a lot of space to sum up all of the accomplishments in 4 years that a student has done. So it has to stand out enough that it can be summarized. And this can leave many students feeling powerless until they realize that they can be in control of how the admissions officers see them, particularly in how they write their essays and how they choose their activities. So that when the admissions counselor walks away from their application, they come with the right conclusion or soundbite about them. A common theme that's in all the aspects of the application: academics, extracurriculars, essays, any supplementary materials that the admissions officer can clearly grab onto without confusion.
And
So
explain about the soundbite. What is this
yes,
to our
we see
audience?
this picture of this lovely lady here. This is something my father and I came to the same conclusion after working with students for a long time and observing how the admissions process worked, that the successful applications had a common theme. They didn't just throw at the admissions officers a series of accomplishments in various unrelated disciplines and then hope that the admissions officers came to the right conclusion that the applicant was hardworking or creative or whatnot. They always had a theme, or, in the words of other people who have observed this phenomenon, a soundbite. There's an excellent book that I would recommend for every parent to read for their child's admission success, which was written by the former dean of admissions at the University of Pennsylvania. She saw hundreds of thousands of applications coming through, and she has this theory that your students should be able to articulate a statement that expresses their identity, their interests, and their passions in 1 or 2 sentences, and then they make their whole application about that, which of course requires either quite a bit of planning ahead of time, or if one is short on time, looking at everything one has done in 4 years and finding the common links and then highlighting those, particularly in the essay sections. So how does the soundbite impact your application strategy? It impacts everything. You're going to want to choose electives based on how you want to present yourself. So let's say your soundbite is that, I'm going to give you an example from a client of mine who was quite successful. Let's say that you're an Indian American, you have a dual sense of identity, and you've developed an interest in social sciences, which you've expressed in your volunteering. And over the years, as you've reflected on your identity, it's made you realize more that your passion is in environmental sustainability studies, and that you want to return to your hometown to implement these strategies of change. If that's your soundbite, which is a very strong one, then you would choose volunteer activities that show commitment to sustainability studies. You would choose summer courses in economics to make that more viable and convincing, or summer programs, let's say. You would make an independent project where you research some kind of indigenous area or some kind of economic problem relating to an indigenous area that was in your hometown. And so you see, in this way, every part of your decision making starts to create a story that the admissions officer doesn't have to dig to find, but that hits them right in the face because you designed it that way.
The admissions officers do not have the time nor the inclination to go searching to find out. If it's made very clear, the story that the student wants to tell, then the chances of success are much greater.
That's right. When you're already starting to consider your child's interests early on, you're going to want to maximize it so that they can start telling a story that's compelling about their interests that expresses the wow factor as well. All right, we're going to look at a couple of examples. I might have to skip some, but these are examples of student-crafted soundbites that successfully got students admitted to Dartmouth and Columbia.
These happen to be 2 students that we worked with who were admitted, one to Dartmouth and the other to Columbia. Well, we'll get to the essay, but the essay was incremental also. It's very important, the essay, especially in the first applicant.
Yeah, the essays are very important because they're the only place where you can eliminate the guesswork from the admissions officer to try to make sense of your application. So if you have a lot of activities in engineering, or there's certain research projects that you've done, you will want to connect those activities with a strong passion or strong story about it in your essays so that the admissions officer says, oh, yes, this makes a coherent whole. This makes sense. I see how this student comes in one neat, very compelling package, you see. And sometimes the best applications, which is another layer of complexity, they combine 2 or 3 things about the student, whether it's their identity culturally or 2 or 3 different passions, and they connect them to create one larger goal that can be explored at the university of choice. And that's very hard to manufacture, but it should arise out of genuine passion from the student. So here are some examples we see on the left. I am a composer and scientist, the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants whose passion for justice and researching the neuroscience behind musical memory arose from my desire to preserve the memories of my parents. All right. This is a very kind of moving story. It explains why the student, in just 2 sentences, or 1, I think, why the student is interested in neuroscience, so that it's not just a random career goal, but something connected to their life. And it also explains more about them personally at the same time, and that's kind of what you want. On the right, we see another example. I am a polymath, but my experience as a jazz pianist and a young entrepreneur made me more open-minded to the emotional lives of others, and therefore more motivated to create artificial intelligence geared towards the public good. So I think we're going to skip on this since we're running a little bit short of time. I had more examples, but students who would work with us would get access to all of these examples of successful students, and they learn to craft their own soundbite early on and to have it guide their application in every step of the way. Before we show some examples of how the Dartmouth and the Columbia applicants express their soundbite in their actual materials, I just want to show you some examples of failures of applications that don't have the correct soundbite. Let's say you have activities that show that you're really good at history. You won a history essay writing competition, and you did research independently on a history capstone project that got some recognition. But you're applying to UPenn, and you kind of want to get into the School of Business because that will make more money. And so you're thinking of applying in business instead. This is what an admissions officer might say because your application doesn't have a story that makes sense. The major doesn't align with your previous interests. They might write, student says they want business, but the application points towards a history major, deny. And then all your hard work, all of your accomplishments simply get tossed away. So the story element is really important, whatever one is considering to do. And therefore taking into account what your son or daughter is strong in and then capitalizing on that. Here's an example below of an instance where someone might not have the very best test score. Here's an SAT score that was a bit low for a pre-med applicant. But in other parts of their application, they showed compelling reasons why they would be interested in pre-med and qualified for pre-med in a way that was touching and that told a story and conveyed a sense of personality.
So this student, even though having lower test scores, slightly lower, would be admitted, whereas the other would not.
Right, because in this right-hand column, the applicant wrote an essay that shows that they cared for their elderly grandparent who had dementia and that inspired him or her to start volunteering at a clinic working with dementia patients.
And getting
so now we have a story. The pre-med major matches with the personal story, which matches with the volunteer experience, which matches with the course load, and therefore they will be put on the admit pile versus someone here who has really strong test scores on the left-hand column, straight A's, but nothing to prove that they're better qualified for pre-med over another candidate in their story. So I think we're going to pause here because I think there might be questions. We've been speaking quite a long time.
Yes, do we have any questions?
I have a question. When you already list all those, the award or all the stunning things that you have done, so in your essay, how do you want to emphasize those, like you already said, I got a champion or I got this on an essay, do you need to also emphasize the word you already got?
Excellent question. Excellent question. It's very difficult for students so young to craft very convincing application essays. And so it's definitely, I would say, the strongest part of the service that we provide, because Dr. Levan is an excellent writer with many years of experience. And so he brings to that a great understanding of style and of messaging, whereas I provide more of the strategy. And so it's a good teamwork that we have.
Well,
And
you're very
specifically,
essay writer too, but
thank you. But
but
it's a team effort for sure. But to answer your question, yes, the essays contextualize the accomplishments. They don't brag about the accomplishments.
and
So
it would be a big mistake to list accomplishments in the essay. First of all, because the space is limited, there are a certain number of words that are allowed only, and can see this. They can have this information, have access to it within
the activities
the
sections.
activity section. Yes.
So in other words, what does a good, strong
There's a
application
message though
essay
that's kind
do?
of related to this. Let's look at it. What if a high school student doesn't know what her interest is?
Very good question. We're going to get to that later, but this is, I think, the hardest part for students. And it especially becomes very climactic when they start writing essays, because a lot of students wonder, what am I going to write about? What do I have to say about myself? They want me to communicate a sense of my identity, but what is my identity? I don't even know yet. And it's very hard because you're only, 17 years old at that point. So it honestly is very difficult. I will say that there are always ways, if you're involved in something already, to go further and to push it beyond what you've already shown engagement in. And we're going to show examples of that later. So keep that in mind, Jenny. It's an excellent question. But I'll give you a quick example for now.
Oh,
Let's
wait, there's
say
another. Oh, sorry. There's another.
if you have a big achievement, but you can't make a story out of it, do you just not mention include in your application, even though it's a larger word? No, Emily. They're different parts of the application. And so every part of the application has to communicate your story, and in equal part. So in your activities section, you're going to want to show activities that you're going to want to list everything you've won, every summer program you've done, every achievement, leadership experience, anything that you've done outside of school, or even as an academic award on that activities section. And your short essay answers and your common app essay, which is the long essay that usually says the most about you, usually in 600 words, is going to help the admissions officers prioritize the right things about your activities. So let's say you have a bunch of awards in languages, and then you have a bunch of academic awards just that are scholastic awards that show that you did well in school. And then you have an internship at the Boeing Institute in aerospace engineering. And then you also have an independent project that you developed with someone in engineering. You're going to want to emphasize the most unique part of that, which can be fit in with the major, and that would be the engineering. And you're going to want to find a story based on that. You see what I mean? So it's very individual, all of this. It's hard to say that there's a rule for everybody because it depends on what you've done, what your interests are, and we do have strategies to help students develop interests, which we'll get
We
to
have one more question
later.
about specific.
How to show a good story in the field of computer science beside the awards. That's very difficult because then you sort of have to ask yourself why you're doing computer science, you see. And this is something that we do quite a lot with students who are brainstorming for essays. I would say half of the work we do is brainstorming and the other half is correcting the essay drafts because of how important it is to set up a good story. So it's entirely dependent on the student. Let's say that I have one candidate who is interested both in philosophy, as in he reads philosophy in his spare time, and he also is interested in computer science. He might have a story about how one day he was reading a book of philosophy and he realized that it was examining the same concept that he did in an internship in computer science. It was the same idea conceptually. And so it made him realize that what he loves about computer science is not just the fact of excelling in the field, but problem solving, which led him to make his own project. You see what I mean? It's totally dependent on what the person has done in their life. So a lot of our work, which I must say is very fulfilling personally, is to sit down with the student and get more of a sense of why they love what they do, what they've done in their life so far, how they can push what they've done a little bit further so that it has more of a wow factor, what kind of programs they might want to apply to, or projects they might want to consider starting and so forth. And then trying to see where the common threads are so that you can start making a message out of it. So this is very individualized. It's according to each person and what they've done in their life and where their interests are.
There's always a way to tie it together with a story.
Always.
It just may take more difficult to find what it is, that thread that connects the story together. Sometimes it's difficult, but it can be done, always.
It can be done. I will say that specifically for computer science candidates, it would be important to have an independent project at some point. There are entrepreneurship programs, and so part of our work, again, when we work with individual clients, is giving them lists and timelines of things they can apply to or steps they can take to show their proficiency in a field beyond what is common or offered within their school, so that they can then have more of a story to say eventually after having done all of that work over 1 or 2 years. So let's say I had a candidate who had a very traumatic event in their life, which took a toll on their emotional well-being. Because of that incident, they started wanting to make computer science projects that had a social good. And so they developed an artificial intelligence platform that analyzed personality models according to the 5-factor model. And that became their project. And then they got a little bit of recognition for it as well, so that it had a stamp of approval. And then they wrote on that, so that they didn't seem like a cold, heartless student who just was trying to win awards, but it seemed like they had a genuine passion. You see, that they connected their intellectual interest to their personal life. So again, it just depends on what your story is. And there are good ways to connect your interests, and there are bad ways as well. Again, there's so many examples I can think of, and I would share them with my clients, definitely. So let's take a quick look at some closer examples, and maybe I'll throw in one more example as well, actually, because it might be important for everyone to see, even outside of this, of a recent client who was an engineering candidate and who was Chinese Americans. I might share that as well as a few passing examples. But first, we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. Let's see all of this come together in an application. Here's our candidate who was admitted to Dartmouth. We said before, she's Russian Jewish. She decided she wanted to study neuroscience and specifically music's impact on recovering memory in Alzheimer's patients. Why did she come to that soundbite? Because I have to say, she looked objectively at what she had done throughout her high school career and even before. She happened to be an excellent pianist, very, very fine pianist, and to have quite a lot of awards and competitions to show for it. And she also happened to be quite a skilled volunteer, interested in social good, as we can see here. All right, but there was no thread in her community service. There was nothing tying it all together, which was a concern of hers.
To be clear, this is somebody we helped to put all of this together.
Right, that's right, and who was successful, I have to say. I'm very proud of her for that.
And I had a hand in the essay, strong one, but I don't write the essays for the students. We brainstorm.
No, that's unethical. We can't do that. But we will especially help them find ideas, which is the hardest part, and then also correct for style, so there aren't stupid cliches and mistakes, metaphors that are clumsy or grammatical mistakes, and so, or the structure is streamlined and so forth. So as we can see here, she was a very talented student, but the danger of her application is that there could have been no thread. It just could have looked like someone who won various awards in languages and music and some sciences and even a little bit of law, and there was no thread. So she had to find one. She looked at the fact that she wanted to do pre-med and the fact that she had interned at a doctor's office. She looked at the fact that she was a musician. She looked at the fact that her father had a very unique background as a Russian Jewish immigrant, and that the memories of her cultural identity are very important to her and that she would never want to lose them. She started volunteering at various nursing homes as a musician and saw a lot of Alzheimer's patients, and she had an idea to combine it all together, which is, again, to combine her knowledge in the sciences, her passion for social justice, which I will show you a little bit about more in a minute in a way that was really impressive that she demonstrated that. And she decided to push that beyond the extra step, which is she founded a music therapy program at a nursing home that was specifically devoted to the intersection of neuroscience and music, you see. So there was proof for her engagement, and she was able to write an essay about that. I'm going to show you how she wrote the essay. She didn't simply list, I became the founder of this organization. She did it in a very clever way that showed, that didn't tell, right? And that's important too. But she combined
the music, the science,
and the social work to make one compelling narrative, and her background, her cultural background. I just want to show you an example of the wow factor before I show you her essay. This is something that she was interested a lot in social justice, and particularly in the issue of criminals being sentenced to death unjustly. So what did she do? Did she just volunteer at some local organization and put in a few hours? No, that would not be distinctive. Anyone can do that. She wrote op-eds to her local newspaper, you see, lobbying for various causes and trying to raise money. Here's one op-ed she did. Here's another op-ed she did in a local newspaper in New York, in her case. And then she got recognition for that. She attached herself to a national chapter called the Innocence Project, and then made an impact herself by putting effort into writing op-eds, which is not what most students do. And then she got recognition for it. And she submitted all of this in supplementary materials, which the college admissions officers read, which gave more validity to her claim that she cared about social justice than if she had just volunteered at some local organization. Now we're going to look a little bit at her essay, how she put all this together, because she had her resume. Her resume could have been confusing because it had a lot of other stuff in it, you know, stuff which is good to show. You should always list any accomplishment that you have.
Yeah.
The fact that she was in a linguistic immersion program in Spain was wonderful, but it wasn't part of her main story. So her essay allowed her to pick out what to her were the important experiences, and the important experiences were linked to the pre-med program at Dartmouth, what was offered there, and to her life aspirations. Here's her essay that was her Common App essay, the long essay that shows most about your personality, not the short essays, which we'll talk about a little bit later. As we can see here, she had a very interesting structure to this paper. Did she just simply state that she created a organization at her local nursing home and then brag about the fact that she was also a musician and therefore she's interested in these things? No. She was far more clever than that. She described a very personal example in very vivid detail, one woman who moved her in the nursing home, who was clutching a doll and who remembered nothing of her past. And this distressed her, okay? Being distressed by this old woman made her think of her father and the fact that she was worried he was starting to forget things, and the fact that she would never want to forget where she came from and where he came from, because the fact that he fled the Soviet Union and was courageous in providing her another life in New York City is part of her core identity. What does it mean to lose our memories? This is an important feature of very good application essays. They don't only tell your story, but at the same time, they show that you have some kind of depth or insight that's not just linked to you wanting to get in. So here she's starting to reflect on what it means to lose your memory, to lose your sense of self, and how traumatic that is. And it was jump-started by this image, which is pretty striking, of a woman clutching a doll and not remembering her name or who she is. She linked that to her father identity and the fact that she would never want to forget it. Then she showed personal agency. So first you have a setup, you have a problem, and we help students to, there's certain formulas that you can use. This one uses the formula of image, problem, usually linked to personal identity, solution, all right? The fact that she reflected on losing your identity made her want to make a difference. Then she talks about playing for this one woman who forgot her name some music that suddenly makes her remember her past, which is something proven in the field of neuroscience, that music has a strange role in memory acquisition. And then she has a concluding paragraph. This communicates so much about her personality and about her goals, preparing her perfectly to then, in a short essay, asking her what her life goals are, to immediately talk in very concrete terms about the fact she wants to do pre-med and do research in neuroscience, and there's a faculty member at Dartmouth who does exactly this kind of research, and she would love to work with him. You see? So it's all linked. It's all linked together.
All
her
connected.
activities that she chose, her personal essay, which has a more personal tone, and then the shorter essays, and I'm going to show you examples of those. They're a little bit more basic. Here's another candidate talking about his passion for computer science. The point is that if someone writes a compelling personal statement that's linked to their intended major or intended academic interest, it's very easy to pivot, to make that pivot if you do it well. For this candidate who got accepted to Dartmouth, I don't have her essay, unfortunately, at this moment for what she did for her essay on the major, but it was very easy for her to then say, I would love to be a pre-med applicant doing research in neuroscience, because her experience proved that she genuinely would love that. And her activities proved that she had already gained experience in doing that. You see? So that's sort of how you want it to work. I think we're running low on time, so I'm going to have to move on.
Any questions before we move on?
I wish I could show you more examples. I have so many. And again, each one is individualized. Back to academics. All right, good questions. Would you touch base on the IB system versus the AP curriculum? Are they weighted equally in college admission? Any pros and cons choosing an IB high school? Excellent question. Ultimately, it's hard to say that one is better than the other when an admissions officer is looking at it on paper. I think it's more about the kind of courses that you choose and the overall difficulty that you craft over a long time based on what is available to you.
I don't think one is better than the other to choose.
One is not considered as better than the other. I will say that the AP sort of has an advantage in that taking the course can then prepare you to take the tests. So I generally recommend AP courses because then it gives you that extra edge of proving your knowledge in a field. So it's a little bit easier to get good grades in an IB system versus the AP, and then you don't have to, necessarily take a test. So I would recommend AP if it's feasible for the student to do well. If the student already feels overloaded and they want to focus on extracurriculars and building their story, and that's already taking a lot of their time and effort, I would tend to go with IB if your school offers that, or if you're thinking of joining an IB high school. So it kind of all depends. I hope that makes sense. Again, it always helps when I look at an individual person and see how much time they have in a week and what they're trying to juggle to create an overall impressive application. Any other questions before we move on? And I think here we're going to start to address some of the questions of, well, how can I develop the wow factor? How can I develop a story?
There's another
question. Great. If one has more than 10 activities, how should one choose the 10 that one should put on the Common App? Really good practical question. For the rest, should one list them on a resume and submit the resume? Thanks.
I
Yes,
want to
Will.
say, I do believe though that the multiplying activities isn't always a very good strategy to go too far with that. And that's sometimes a misconception. People think the more I do, the more in quantity, the better. No, a lot of times that they're looking for one or two passions that one might have, strong interests, and that's enough. One doesn't have to have 10 different diverse activities.
Right.
Sometimes
So
that can actually be to one's disadvantage because one gets too dispersed.
yeah, the messaging gets lost so that we're not sure what you're the best in, right? We're not sure where you're excellent in compared to everybody else. If you have too many interests that you're not allowing yourself to pursue to the point that you're better than anybody else at it. That's a very good general point. But specifically, let's say that you're the kind of wonderful candidate that happens, and I have to say I've seen many of these, many wonderful candidates who happen to be so incredible that they have more than 10 activities and they're all really impressive and you all want to list all of them. I can say I was this kind of applicant myself. I had more than 10 activities in music alone. And so I couldn't possibly put it in the little space that they gave me on the Common App. So what you do is you list your 10 most impressive ones and the 10 most diverse ones, the 10 that show your story the most. All right. So for example, if you're trying to bill yourself as someone who is an excellent engineer, who also happens to be an excellent dancer, I don't know, then you would choose the most impressive in those two things, and then that's it. And then what you do, exactly as Will suggested in the chat, is that you submit as a supplementary material and you make sure to write a cover letter that is personally addressed to the school to which you're sending the material. And again, there's a formula to this. So that's pretty easy so that you make sure they see it and it doesn't get lost. You put it on a resume. They let you attach one usually on the Common App. And then sometimes you can even submit an extended resume as a supplementary sample if you have that many talents in a field that can't even fit in one generalized resume. It all depends, right, on what your strengths are. But it doesn't mean the end if you exceed the 10 activity count. It doesn't mean that your activities, your accomplishments are going to be discounted. There's space in a resume or an extended resume as a supplementary material. So that's a really, really good point that Will just brought up for everybody. Okay, so very quickly, because we want to leave time for questions at the end, we're just going to rip through this part as quickly as we can. So the question is, so if you're starting later, of course, your strategy is different. It's the time to look at everything you've done, reflect, and even if, as I showed you with the candidate who was admitted to Dartmouth, even if it looks a little messy, your resume, and there isn't a clear story, you can kind of pick out the story you want and create it anyway. But what if you're starting really early and you have the opportunity and the luxury to sort of craft your story from the very beginning, which is always a better strategy. So starting in 8th grade, you start thinking, how am I going to explore my interests so that I can stand out? I don't think I really stand out. So what am I going to do? And the first thing that you can do as a parent, and also that we do with our clients, is that we reflect with your child their major interests. So let's say, what are they good at in school? More than something else. You know, are they stronger in the science? It can start out really general if you have no clue, or it can be something more specific until you get there. But are they stronger in the humanities, or are they stronger in the sciences? Is there a particular science that they did well in, you know, in middle school, or that they particularly enjoyed and they'd like to get better at? Is there any extracurricular they did? Did they dance as a child and they could get better at dancing? What can you capitalize on that's kind of already there? I mean, even if, for example, you're a Chinese speaker, is there a way that we can capitalize on my culture a little bit more, where I'm sort of working for causes that propagate a better understanding of Chinese culture, or I'm entering Chinese poetry contests? Is there anything in my background that I can maximize? And then even personal interest can go a long way. I had a student who loved video games, and a strange side effect of the kind of video games he loved was that they focused a lot on tanks, like Soviet era and World War II tanks. So he happened to be freakishly knowledgeable about military history. And so what we did almost immediately after that is find any program to sign him up in that made his interest in military history stronger and sort of backed up by something objective.
Yeah, and it was stimulated by his interest initially by video games. But you see, we made something good out of that in
You
the
might
end.
think
But
you have nothing
yeah,
as an interest, but you might actually have one that you can explore.
there's a question. I think it's a very good one. Just came in the chat.
A confusing question. Oh, we love those. Thank you, Dr. Levan, for pointing that out. A confusing question. Does a student in a less competitive but a good school have more opportunities to get in the top colleges than in a very competitive school? Because maybe the student will take much more time to get good academic grades in the very competitive school and have no time to do more extracurricular activities, just assuming the student has strong academic skills.
You're right. And a lot of people have this idea that if they place their child in an elite private school, and where everybody is highly academically imposing, then they have a better chance because of the school itself. But that's not really the case necessarily, because they're competing against students who are all at the very top. They may be at the bottom of their class, or they might be in the middle of their class. But somebody in a school which is not maybe the very top, but that student happens to be at the top of the class, they will have a better chance getting in.
That's a very good point, very well asked and then also answered. I will say that there are pros and cons to attending an elite school. The pros are that they have a lot of inbuilt support for students. The parent has to do a lot less, and in a sense, the student has access to a lot more that will help them. They often have counselors there. They have very good honors AP, IB curricula that you can take advantage of. They have really good teachers, So in that sense, it can be a real big boost because you don't have to find this yourself, as I must say, my parents had to, for example, for me, and as they have to recommend for many students who are in lower ranking schools. It's harder to find opportunities when your school doesn't provide them. You're the one who constantly has to seek them out.
But then they ask you at one point in the charter school that you were involved in, they asked where you were ranked, and you could say ranked first because there wasn't a very competitive
There wasn't competition,
school.
yeah.
So
and
that
then also the negative, the con, I will say, aside from the fact that it's harder to do well in a top school, of course, it's also that, but also something else. It's the fact that elite schools will have many students applying to the same top schools. So, if you're in the middle of nowhere applying from a school that's, a little bit underprivileged, actually, they're going to look at that as more unique than 10 applications from the same prep high school. The problem is then you're going to have to stand out against all other 9 students who are applying. So you're right, you're going to have something that puts you above your fellow applicant from the same prep school having to do with extracurriculars. And if you don't have time for that, it's not a smart thing to do. If you don't have time to develop a story, it's not going to help you beat out those other candidates from the same school, which is what you'll need to do.
Also, I would say that recently, to a certain degree, some of the top schools are a bit sensitive about the accusation that for many, many years they were pretty much the schools for the elite and the rich. And they try to change that image. And so they are maybe even a little bit tougher on the people who are coming from the top prep schools than somebody who's seems to have, not had all of the advantages, but they did quite well regardless. This is within limits, of course. There's still a fairly large percentage of people who do get into these schools from some of the elite schools. So it's a higher percentage than in the general population, right, for sure.
So again, it's a balancing act. It's all about, that's why this is a very individual thing, as you put the point, Cindy, it's a very good point. If you feel you can go to a prep school and do very well academically while developing one strong passion, either through the school or preferably a little bit outside of it, and you can handle all that, then do it. That will be very good for you. If you feel that you're going to go to the prep school and then maybe struggle a little bit with the course load so that you only can do that all day, and then by the time you write your essay, you have nothing to write about, not a good strategy.
We have to move on, I think, because we have
Okay,
something like
so
15 minutes.
I'm just going to run through this very quickly. How do you get there? One way is to start trying to go further in your interests as a student. So let's give an example here. Let's say that in academics, a student loves civics and history, especially history of war and geopolitics. And extracurriculars there, they do Model UN, which is kind of a basic standard thing to do. A lot of people do Model UN, so it's not sufficient. They did a summer course at Duke on American foreign policy. They did a summer course at Yale. And all these things are not required, by the way. There are summer programs that are free. There are ways to stand out in ways that are free because these summer courses can be expensive. And then they enjoy reading the news. Well, what can they do to make themselves stand out? Let's make an example. In academics, they can write an essay and ask their teachers at their school, or us, especially in the humanities, since we specialize in that, how they might submit it for awards. Or you might host a debate on the subject of your interest and be the one responsible for organizing it. You might capitalize on the fact that you are in Model UN by trying to win something, or create a new initiative that no president has done, or take the summer courses that you did and make it into a seminar to teach other students so you're not keeping the information to yourself. If you're interested in the news, you might submit to op-eds to local newspapers on a cause, as the Dartmouth student did that we looked at. You might try to launch a podcast and get lots of attention on it so that you can enact real change. You see, there are many possibilities and they're not just one way. I'm just going to pause on this slide for a minute and maybe we can ask questions. Here's an example of what you might do if you want to develop your interests. In the arts, it's very simple. Usually you develop an arts portfolio. Something people don't know usually about arts portfolios, which most of the major universities accept, is that when you submit one, it can give you a major boost in your application because all the materials are forwarded to a faculty member. And the faculty member in that department, let's say you submit a visual arts portfolio and it goes to the Department of Visual Arts, Arts and Architecture and so forth. They will write a report on whether the materials are good. And if they say the materials are good, it boosts your whole application up tremendously. It can excuse a multitude of sins. So many people don't take advantage of the arts portfolios enough.
For example, one can want to study physics at the highest level, and that's your goal, but you play very well the violin. They forward your arts portfolio to the conductor of the student orchestra, and they say, I need violinists, good violinists. They're going to push for you to go to the university and be admitted.
Exactly, and this is a service we also provide, is support through the art portfolio process. And some of you who are interested in STEM might ask, is it the same way? Can you make a portfolio for STEM? You can, it's a little bit more complicated, but usually it will take the form of research abstracts that you've produced or research that you've produced, and you make it into a nice little package and you prepare it as a supplementary material. So anyway, these are a lot of examples. We can't pause too long, but as you can see, in every single proclivity or interest that you might have, whether it's athletics, service, entrepreneurship, STEM, humanities, the arts, there are ways to show more interest than simply professing it or taking a class in school or being part of a club. There are ways to push beyond that, and that's definitely something that we can advise you on. If you're not sure what your passion in, there are ways to kickstart it. You can apply to various internship or work experience programs or summer programs. I wish I could stay more and explain to you on each of these programs, but if you have questions, please be sure to keep them for the question and answer session.
But I mean, all of this, everything is important. The Morningstar mathematics, that's part of the application too.
Oh yes, I just wanted to say, you have to adopt a maximalization mindset. A lot of you here have your children enrolled in other MSI courses. Definitely, this is something that you can make a part of your application. You list it in your activities or your resume if you don't have room for it on your main activities list. And you can also make it part of a short essay prompt. How many students are interested in classic literature? Not many. That's something that makes you stand apart. Well, at the MSI summer program, there are courses that are taught on classic literature where students can become familiar with appreciating great works by British and English and Russian authors. And there also activity-based classes that push you to learn math specifically geared for winning competitions. There's a course specifically geared at MSI, Morningside Institute, to competition writing, which my father and I are going to co-jointly teach, where students prepare written work ready for publication by the end of the course to poetry magazines, to essay writing contests, to flash fiction prizes. And then even in non-tangible ways, should your child take something like classic literature instead of something more concrete like competition math or competition writing, you still can make that important part of your application. In a supplementary material, some students submit a reading list, which can come in handy in the interview process if you maximize it, because you can present it to your interviewer, who then can see upon quizzing you that you've actually read these books and understood them, which immediately makes you an interesting candidate. Or you can write a short essay prompt when they ask what you like to do in your free time about how much you enjoyed the works of Charles Dickens, the 19th century English author, and how you wrote alternate endings to a novel by Charles Dickens just for fun. And then that's quirky, that shows passion, that shows a different side of you, especially if you're very good at school or very good in the sciences and you want to show that you're well-rounded and not a cookie-cutter applicant. So everything you do can be maximized to your benefit. Here are some research opportunities. I will say that, especially if you're in STEM, but also if you're in the humanities, and we definitely provide this kind of advice, again, individualized to the student, on how you can best use your summers and how you can best push your current interest to the next level. But there's also research that you can start getting into, some programs that are free, or free even paying you with a stipend, that you can get involved with to already start producing research as a high schooler, which is extremely impressive to an admissions committee where they usually only see undergraduates producing research. You can write a whole essay on the research that you produced and immediately stand out. And here is the same for the humanities. And there's strategies also where for free you can be involved in a program and contact local professors near you to try to do that. We would guide students through that process. There's one more thing I just want to talk about, volunteering. A lot of people wait for volunteering until the last moment, and this is a big mistake, because in some of the short essay prompts, they specifically ask you to talk about your community impact and how you're going to bring it to the school of your choice. So let's say at Duke, they have the PACE Center for Civic Engagement. That's a major part of the school. It's a main draw of the school. And you've done no volunteering, and you've done no volunteering that you can specifically talk about continuing at Duke. That's a major lost opportunity. And you want to start volunteering as early as possible. And many people don't know what to do with volunteering, and so there's an excellent organization that we always recommend called the Lion's Heart, where they pair you with various opportunities that you get to choose based on what you're interested in. So let's say, again, you're interested in economics. You can choose an opportunity that's linked to sustainability somehow, like providing water to people in need. If you're more interested in education, you can tutor. And so you individualize what kind of volunteering you do, you rack up hours, and then based on how many hours you do, you can get awards. The President's Volunteer Service Award, which is signed by the current president, or the Congressional Award, which is signed by a congressperson, nearest to you, or the Torchbearer Award, which is very highly well regarded, which also requires you to make a little project, a community service project, which is also something you could write about in your essay. Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to skip through this, although there were additional points to this presentation. But I'm just going to go to the last point here before we open it up to questions very quickly. Here you can see a little bit more of the services that we provide, especially if you feel a little bit overwhelmed. Conceivably, every parent could do this themselves. Then they would have to be the kind of crazy parents that I had, for example, who really devoted a lot of time to mentoring us through all of this process. We provide a lot of services, and they're based on what grade your child is.
It's very hard to know. It's very hard to find all this out, though. It
is very hard. It's very hard to synthesize it. Yeah. It does require specialist knowledge. So there are different packages that we offer, and I encourage you to reach out to Yoon to talk about more of the specifics, especially how much the cost breakdown and also what your child would sort of be looking into. But already there are different things we can provide depending on your needs. In 8th to 10th grade, most of our packages have to do with strategizing with your child on choosing the best courses to suit their interests, brainstorming what kind of story they might want to start creating, providing lists of opportunities and deadlines and a timeline for getting into opportunities that express their interests, establishing test-taking timelines, starting to build portfolios with them, everything that sort of prepares the application process and that requires more time to unfold, as well as test-taking assistance for SAT and ACT prep. When you get to 11th and 12th grade, and 12th grade is very late, we have two kinds of packages. The emergency packages, you started too late and you just want help for your essays. So we have that kind of package. We have a basic advising package for 11th grade, and then a portfolio advising package if you want to stand out and create a portfolio. And then what we most often recommend if you're not pressed for time is our comprehensive package, because it's more in-depth kind of help. Not only do you get a lot of mentoring on your college applications, both the main Common App essay and the supplemental college essays, but you also get resume building advice, resume proofreading. You wouldn't believe how an application can be taken down simply by not completing the form correctly. So we would help guide students through that as well. And then they're in different levels depending on how many hours you would be willing to sign up for per week and what your needs would be. And the pricing would differ according to that. So I think at this point, we're going to open up for questions, any questions that may be had. And again, keeping in mind that any questions in terms of pricing and the actual breakdown of the services provided can definitely be redirected to our liaison contacts.
I saw you have many packages. I have question like, if, for example, student very good, score good, test score good, everything is good, they prepare, but the students not good, have a habit to prepare the easy or prepare the whole application process, but the parents, some parents they don't understand English, they don't know how to push the kids or help the kids. Do you have like a package, like you just like writing those easy for those students? Not like a package, like a step by step if they need. For example, if they got a top college, and then they can buy next step for interview, and then they can there. But first step, they just want to get application.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is a good point, right? So if I have to restate the question, you were asking, what if your student is a really good student and does very well in that, doesn't need any advice on that? The only advice they would need would be in building the extracurriculars, building that sense of identity, building that sense of story, that soundbite, and particularly expressing it through the essay. So advice on how to build the extracurriculars and then how to express them in the essays. What if you wanted to separate that? Definitely the kind of services actually I enjoy the most is just helping students with their essays. The college essay writing assistant package would be one that you would be looking for.
Yeah, there was a question that just came in about that, about the diversity essay.
I wish I could have gotten more into that because these are really, really good questions, and we definitely like getting in depth on that. But I just wanted to address this last question very quickly. And then under the basic advising package, these are all customizable depending on your student needs. So usually we would meet for a consultation session and see what your child needs. But let's say you sign up for a 2-week period of time where you meet 2 or 3 times a week. The focus could be mainly on the extracurricular planning. And it depends on how early your child comes to. At the end, it's more about putting it all together in 11th and 12th grade, depending on what's already been done, with a little bit of advice on the next steps in terms of showcasing those extracurriculars. And then earlier, it's more about preparing a plan so that it all unfolds naturally. So yes, to answer your question, yes, there would be packages just to address those sides if you've already handled the more academic side.
And now for the diversity essay, I mean,
okay, so then we have,
first I'll
can
give it-
you please give a suggestion on how to write the diversity type of essay, especially for an Asian student? Yeah, this is a really good point to bring up.
general
What do you
advice,
do?
it's a specific advice that would be the most useful considering the individuality of the student. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly, as Dr. Levan said. So basically what it would look like if you came to me or to Dr. Levan and with some advice, looking for some advice. How do I write the diversity type of essay? I don't feel very diverse. I'm Asian. What do I do? Then I would start digging in your background for any possible angles that show diversity, even if you don't see them first. For example, if you are doing an activity that brings you into contact with diverse populations. And in general, whenever you're volunteering or doing any art, anything that has a subjective quality to it, you're going to want to try to engage that with a community that needs your help. I think we saw that on an earlier slide, even though we went through it pretty quickly. Let's say that you enjoy tutoring. Have you tutored in a Title X school? If you have, then you might write an essay about how you met and befriended someone that you taught there and learned a lot from them about what it means to be open-minded. And in that way, also, you're subtly showing off the fact that you're community-oriented. So you could do that. I had a student who was a musician and who wrote their whole essay about how, with specific examples of a concert where he encountered French gypsy jazz and Caribbean funk and Spanish rhythms in one concert with different musicians from different cultures. He was able to reflect on how music makes him connect with people of all ages, backgrounds, and races. You see, even though that particular student was white, a Caucasian student, and couldn't look at their background so much. And then also there are different kinds of diversity. There's socioeconomic diversity. So let's say that your parents or your grandparents grew up dirt poor. You might want to recount the time that you went home to visit them in their little village. And I've had some students do that pretty successfully. So you can sort of think broader about what diversity means other than the tone of your skin, since you can't control that, and sort of broaden the definition. And then it can be quite convincing. Okay, one more question. If a competitive candidate to the top colleges must have one art specialty and one athletic specialty at least, I would say you need to have one or two specialties. Colleges like specialists. It doesn't necessarily have to be art. It doesn't necessarily have to be athletics. It doesn't necessarily have to be STEM, but one or two complementary interests that balance the other out. So you might be an extremely good athlete and then also very, very good at linguistics. You see, and as long as you have those two specialties that are proven through your activities and then through your essays, through your community engagement, whatever, then it will be convincing. That's a really good question, though. All right, do we have any more questions? If not, I just want to say that all of you parents have the MSI contact. So please feel free to contact MSI if you need individual help, if you want more details of the packages, if you have more personalized questions that are more applicable to your situation, just feel free to definitely contact us through MSI contact. Any more questions? I think we got another one. How to show the piano level certificate is meaningful. If I had to rephrase your question, do you mean you play the piano and you want to show your piano skills in your application in a meaningful way, right? How would you do that? So again, this is the kind of personalized help I really enjoy doing for each candidate because it's different for everybody, right? You got the level 10 certificate on piano. Excellent. That's very good, Will. I mean, you're going to write that down in your activities section. And then it depends on what you want to major in, right? And what you want your connection to the school to be, whether they have a strong music program and there's something there where you'd see yourself being a strong fit. But either in your Common App essay, depending on whether you want to major in something music adjacent or music, or in a short answer where they ask you what you're passionate about, you would expand on your interest in piano beyond the certification. So you not only would list your certification either on your resume or on your list of activities on the Common App form, but then you take it a step further and sort of explain why you love music. This is a difficult process, and I love providing this kind of advice. There's a sort of delicate balance, an essay at times where you show that you're a specialist in a field. So in this case, you show that you're really good at piano, but not in an obvious way. So you might talk about pieces that you've played by Chopin, or the fact that you are really fascinated by Chopin's life and you find analogies between his life and yours. And while you're writing that essay, if you provide enough detail that shows that you've done research on that composer's life, you convince the committee not only that you got a certificate on paper, but that your connection to piano is genuine and that you really are a specialist. So it's a really good thing that you got the level 10 plus certificate on piano. Congratulations on that. You just want to contextualize that. How do you write the why school essay? Excellent question. I'm going to try to find an example very quickly so that we can look a little bit at what that is like. By the way, while we're here, I just want to show you an example of someone talking about a passion that they have outside of school. And this prompt specifically asked you to talk about a passion outside of school. So if you don't have anything, it can be a problem. And they talked about their faith at a Hindu temple. And because they did it with enough detail, where they seemed like an authority on the subject, it came across as impressive. Okay, so let's look at this why Georgia Tech essay. The basic process for writing a why school essay is to look at your strengths and then, or your meaningful activities. So I'm going to use an example again from a recent client who was an intern at the Boeing Institute. And while he was there, he worked on an artificial intelligence project. So given that fact, he's going to look at what artificial intelligence opportunities for research or course loads in his specific field exist at that school. So what he's going to do is he's going to make a sort of topic sentence about himself that's unique to him. And then he's going to talk about the things that prove that he is indeed what he says he is in terms of concrete stuff that he's done. In the case of my other student, it was a Boeing internship with artificial intelligence. And then you're going to connect it to the school and the offerings they have there.
That's very important because one has to do research to know what's specific about the school. They can feel when you, and they can sense when you're just using the same template for every school and not specifying the answer, the essay, to what is unique about their school. And if they feel that, they're not going to want you to be there.
That's right. So you're going to want to look for what is uniquely offered by that school that's not necessarily offered at another school. I like helping students to do this kind of research. You can look at the kind of professors that are there and whether they align with your previous interests, or you can look at any study abroad opportunities that are at no other school, and then you just connect it to yourself. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm very grateful to the Institute for hosting us both today and for this collaboration. And thank you all for your questions, definitely.
Any further comments?
Yes, we would like to thank Dr. Lavin and Solène for this wonderful value educative workshop. Yeah, I personally learned a lot. Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. And also I want to thank everyone for attending this workshop. Yeah, if any question, we keep in touch.